Hello, San Diego Comic-Con at home, and welcome to the Best Advice I Ever Got panel. I'm Tricia Narwani, editorial director of Del Rey Books, and I'll be your moderator today. If you're here today, I know you're looking for advice to become a better writer, reader, and a more spiffy human being. And the best advice I can give you is to stay tuned, to listen to our panelists, and let their wit and wisdom guide your way. Our panelists will introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into the conversation. So Kevin, we'll get started with you.
Okay, hi. My name is Kevin Hearne. I'm the author of the Iron Druid Chronicles and the Seven Kennings epic fantasy series, the Tales of Pell, which I have co-authored with Delilah S. Dawson, and also the forthcoming Ink and Sigil, which is set in the Iron Druid world. And I'm super happy to be here and hope we can help you guys out today.
And I also want to mention we have two debut novelists on our panel, starting with Micaiah Johnson.
Yeah, I'm Micaiah Johnson, Kaya. I'm the author of the forthcoming Space Between Worlds, out August 4th, pre-order now. And I am so excited to, well, not be in San Diego. I'm still in Nashville, where I've discovered timidity is a thing and I'm not happy about it, but I'm just super stoked to be here.
And we also have another debut author, Alexis.
Hey, I'm Alexis Henderson. I am the author of the forthcoming The Year of the Witching, which is a dark fantasy / horror novel. I'm super excited to be on this panel.
And we also have one of my favorite people in the business, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. You're one of my favorite people too. I'm Sarah Kuhn. I write urban fantasy paranormal romance series called Heroine Complex. It's about Asian American superheroines in San Francisco. The latest one is called Haunted Heroine, my Halloween super special of the series. And I also write comic books. I wrote a comic book called Shadow of the Batgirl for DC Comics. It's about Cassandra Cain, who's the Asian American Batgirl. And recently I also wrote a Star Wars audiobook original about Dr. Aphra, who is the coolest character in all of Star Wars. And if you don't know who she is, you should find out.
And finally, we have a gentleman that I am lucky to know very well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Josh Malerman. I am the author of Bird Box, Unburied Carol, Inspection, and Malorie, which is coming out soon. Or I don't, yeah. And I live in the Detroit area. And I have a whole crate that's, you can't see, filled with rough drafts of like 30-something other novels that I hope to unload on Tricia sporadically through the
I cannot wait to read all of them. So I always love to start a panel with a lighthearted question. We're all doing a lot of cooking and eating in quarantine. What dish would you advise as a pairing for your latest book? Now, Kevin, I've been lucky to experience your cooking and your food recommendations, so I'd love to hear your answer.
Okay, sure. Hey, I should probably show you this. This is my cover art in the US and the UK version of Ink and Sigil, and it's set in Glasgow, UK. And so if you're going to be eating a little something while you're reading Ink and Sigil, then maybe you would like to have a nice haggis and a dish called rumbledy thumps, which is just a lot of fun to say, much less eat. It's basically potatoes, carrots, and onions and cabbage with cheese melted on top. Whoa. And it's just, yeah, a lot of fun. And then maybe a nice whiskey to go with it, whatever you like, something from the Highlands, maybe something peaty. And yeah, that's what I would go with.
So Sarah, after we've had our rumbledy thumps, what should we have next?
Okay, so Haunted Heroine is, it's, as I said, set during Halloween. It's also set during a very important moment in one of the protagonist's life. She is pregnant, and so she's having all kinds of weird cravings, and she's very sad because all of her favorite kind of junk food staples make her feel sick. So she starts eating this snack that's basically a pickle with peanut butter and furikake, which is like a Japanese like seasoning. And that's what she eats for the whole book. And then if you want something else that you don't have to make yourself, because in this book they are going undercover as college students, they eat a lot of Taco Bell. So you could also eat Taco Bell.
So Alexis, I'm both excited and terrified to learn what we should eat with your book.
I was thinking like a rare beef roast and like a big goblet of red wine. Yeah, kind of like bloody, a little bit gross, but like delicious. Yeah.
And Josh, what are we eating in the apocalypse?
I think canned peaches is like a delicacy for this trio for now. And I think any booze she finds at all, I mean, it could be like Goldschlager would be like heaven, you know? So, in other words, anything you got at hand is going to be good enough for Malorie, that's for sure.
You know things are bad when you're down to the Goldschlager.
Goldschlager and canned peaches.
And Kaya, what are we having in the space between worlds?
Yeah, I was thinking about how much it's about things that are out of place. And so anything that like combines things that maybe don't belong. So I don't know, some bacon wrapped dates or like pineapple on pizza, which I'm realizing are things that people hate and probably not good advertisement, but anything like that. And then all kinds of like cheap alcohol. So like a Pabst Blue Ribbon, or maybe like not just like the ironically cheap beers, but like the true, honest, natty ice cheap beers.
I like the pineapple on pizza, just for the record. I'm like the only person anymore.
Oh, I do.
Maybe why people have such strong opinions, and I'm like,
I know.
California, because
This is quite a buffet we have going in any case.
Okay, so let's get the core question of the panel done with. The single best piece of writing advice you've received in your life. And Sarah, you've written so many books. I'm sure you've heard a lot.
Okay, so I feel like I thought about this a lot because I want to take this very seriously. And I think that the best advice I've actually gotten was to stop taking every single piece of advice I saw, whether that's online, whether that's in person, whether it's at a convention or conference, whatever it is. You know, when I first started writing, I was very sort of devoted to the idea of doing things right, like learning how to do things right. And so I really sought out advice. I looked for it everywhere. I was really thirsty for it, kind of every level I went through. And what I eventually realized is a lot of people who are giving advice, and this is not saying all people or to cast shade on those who do, but it's sort of presented in this way where it's like, I did X, therefore if you copy my path exactly, you will also have Y results. And I think as we all know now, at this point, most creative industries don't work that way. If you do X, you might not get Y result. You might get a completely different result. You might get no result at all. And I think this is especially important for those of us who are writers of marginalized identities. I think me as a woman of color taking an advice from white writers, me moving through the industry is obviously not the same. So a lot of that advice is not going to apply the same way. It might not even apply at all. So I have to say that once I figured out that I did not have to actually take every single piece of advice that I got, I felt much more free and much more able to let in the things that were actually going to help me.
So Alexis, I'd love to hear from you next.
Yeah, the best advice I've ever gotten was actually from a professor that I had in college, and she told me to follow your bliss, which is something like a lot of people say. And I heard more advice like, you know, as I got older, and it was all some variation of just like write the stuff that you like. So whether it's like a whole book or a scene or a genre, I just tend to follow whatever I enjoy writing. And if I don't enjoy writing something, I scrap it or I approach it a different way. And it kind of fosters a sense of like curiosity and excitement so that I'm always interested and invested in, you know, what I'm writing and what I'm working on. And it's such simple advice, but I find that when I follow it and only write the things that I'm interested in and passionate about and just kind of fascinated by, I tend to get to like a good place with my writing. So
Kaya?
Yeah, this is going to be very much in line with what Sarah said, which is a great company to be in. So my favorite piece of advice is one that's kind of grown with me as I've written. And when I was first starting out, Leila Leilani told me like how you take criticism will dictate how far you go. And when I was brand new, that meant like, you know, don't have an attitude when people like are trying to educate you and like be open to the possibility of correction and all of these things. You know, that kind of the first, you know, when you're first learning about the business and you're first learning these things. But then that kind of has like evolved to where I was told later still about how you take criticism that was saying like, And it was a professor also who told me, like, jealously guard the things that you don't want outside voices to affect. And so it's still about how you take criticism, but it kind of morphs from like, be open to correction to like, really like know how to evaluate the voices that you're hearing. And so that's kind of like the same piece of advice, but it's like kind of matured with me. And then of course, then I get to like selling the book, and then it just turns into listen to your editor, dear God, listen to your editor. But just that idea of like being mindful about like how you're taking in criticism, and like, so begin with like check your ego enough not to just reject everything that you think disagrees with you, but then also pull back from a place where you blanketly accept everyone's opinion, and instead like establish a system of evaluating something that honors both your openness to improvement, but also like keeps intact those parts of you on which you're not willing to compromise, which again, like Black women writers, like you have to like really, really like put those walls up to make sure that you have that uncompromising core that you can maintain.
Josh?
The best and worst advice I got are both like philosophical rather than technical. And I think that makes sense in a way too, because, you know, your reality with writing is, you know, depending on what takes root, right, can have a profound effect on you. And I don't remember exactly where I heard this, but man, did it take root where it was with the rough draft. It just does not matter if it's good or bad. Just get rid of the words good and bad. They don't even, there's no room for them. There's no place for them. It's not even a matter of that. They're irrelevant. And the minute, you know, I quote unquote failed at writing novels for like 10 years, which to me a failure is only if you just didn't finish one. And so for 10 years, I'm like, but I realized at some point, I wasn't finishing them because I was worried, is this good or bad? And then the minute that was gone, and I even like said to myself, dude, just write a bad book. Because once you write a book, then maybe you can write a second one, and maybe that won't be as bad. That first one wasn't bad, it doesn't matter, but it got me through that process. It got me through that rough draft to see to the end, and it didn't matter. Is this a bad street name? Is this a bad character name? And I have friends who are brilliant who get stuck on that stuff. You know, they're like, yeah, that first sentence just was killing me. I'm like, first sentence, man. You can like, you're going to rewrite this book like 11 times. Let's worry about that at the end. You know, don't even worry about that right now. So for me, that was the most liberating advice I ever received was understanding that it was more important to have 300 pages that I could fix rather than no pages at all. And it just did not matter how good or bad they were.
And finally, Kevin?
I actually got mine from an Elmore Leonard listicle kind of thing that he did way back when. And a lot of the things on that list, I actually don't follow, but the number 10 on the list, I do. And I might not be remembering it word for word, but it basically boils down to try not to write the parts that you want to skip. And that means, you know, when you're reading something, be a little bit aware of when you're getting bored and I can skip that paragraph, maybe this whole page. And when that happens to you, just sort of analyze why, what is happening there? What is the author doing that you are not digging? And once you start to identify those things that are not working for you, then when it comes time for you to write your story, then you are able to perhaps skip those kind of things, or at least identify when those things are happening in your own writing. You skip that part, and your pacing really improves as a result. So, and this is one of the things that you tell me, Tricia, that I do very well with is my pacing. So that is probably the best advice that I have gotten. Other parts of that list, again, I don't agree with at all, but that particular thing has really served me well. So there you go.
Well, in your answers, you've all talked about getting bad advice and sorting out good from bad advice. If I'm an aspiring writer, how do I decide what advice to follow and what advice to ignore? Let's start with Alexis.
As a rule of thumb, I take any advice that works for me and I scrap everything that doesn't. So if it makes writing easier, it's the best advice in the world and I follow it. And if it makes it harder, then I pretend I never heard it and kind of move on. So I think, yeah, it's kind of like trial by fire with writing advice. You have to like test it out to see if it works for you.
And Kevin?
every so often you'll see somebody show up on social media and declare some sort of grand rule. If you don't write every day, you're not a writer. Well, I guess I'm not a writer then, right? Because I don't write every day. And whenever you see some sort of general grand proclamation like that, it's sort of like what Sarah was saying. That is a proclamation that works very well for that particular person, but may not apply to you. Your mileage may vary. And so I really do not write every day. I have to go and refill the well. But when I do write, I try to write about 1,000 words or so, especially right nowadays. You know, it's tough to get more than that somehow. Don't feel everything flowing as well as it used to when you have so many distractions and the world's on fire. So I try to do those things, but again, I don't feel that I'm doing it wrong or I'm not a real writer if I don't write every day. There are people that I know who are binge writers that will not write for weeks, and then they'll have a weekend where they're busting out like 20, 30,000 words in a weekend, like half a novel practically. And that blows me away, but that means that they just process things differently. Their brain works differently than mine does. And so they are actually working on that story before they sit down to type it. They know what's going to happen and they just get it done that way. And that's cool too. So how you get it done does not matter. It's getting it done that matters. There you go.
Sarah?
I think, first of all, I would say kind of along those lines, always consider the source. You know, look at who is giving the writing advice. I've been to conventions where there's like a panel led by a writing expert who I've never heard of and has apparently never published any actual novels. So I always feel like maybe that writing advice is not the best. It hasn't maybe been tested and tried out and, you know, proven to be right. So just, I would say, consider that. Consider like how someone is giving it. I think the one thing that really turns me off now is also along the lines of what Kevin was saying, which is when someone sort of throws open the door on Twitter and is like, you must do this to be considered a real writer. You must do X, Y, and Z. And what they really mean is, again, is I do this and it works for me. It works for me. That's all they know, is that it works for them. So I think like having an idea of that is always helpful. If someone comes in more like, hey, here's like something that worked for me, maybe it'll work for you. Like Kevin said, your mileage may vary. I think for me, like one thing that has become very important is like kind of taking the temperature of maybe the attitude and the approach of the person actually giving the advice. And sometimes that helps me separate what might actually be useful to listen to.
Oh, Kaya?
Yeah, I'm once again just copying off of Sarah. That's what I'm doing here. But yeah, I think source is so important, especially if you know, there are people who I like have in my community who I will take wild advice from. Whereas it's like, if it's a random stranger that's just like, you should do this drastic thing, I'm like far less receptive. But like having like trusted people who you know like have your best interests at heart and are like just generous and like kind people, I think like those are advices you can trust, even if they do make you feel a little uncomfortable. Whereas again, like the random, you know, person is gonna lean over and be like, you know what you need to do, you know what you should be writing, you know how you should be living your entire life. It's just, it doesn't feel like it's coming from like an authentic place of like care. So absolutely, like I'm more willing to like interrogate like advice that feels uncomfortable for me if it's from somebody who I know, like who I've known, I've had this long history with, who's maybe taken my advice in the past and who I know like have my best interests at heart.
And finally, Josh.
I guess for me, I feel like there's sort of like a rhythm to everything, and that includes advice, not just the writing itself. And like, you know, if you can dance to a song, can I dance to this advice? Can I move to this advice? You know, is this something that I can go with? Like, I am also wary of never do this, always do this. But really the best, and I'm not trying to sound like a kiss up, the best writing advice I ever get is from Tricia or the copy editor. Really, you know, it's like, maybe it's because I've been in a band for 20 years, so I'm very used to writing the song and then bringing it to the band and then they play it however they want, right? So I'm very used to bringing an idea and then watching it go in a direction that maybe I didn't even have in mind. And so the same thing with Bird Box becoming a movie, I was very free about all that, you know, and people will ask like, were you upset about the change? No, are you kidding me? I'm so glad this happened at all. It's like, I brought the song, they played it, and that's how they played it, great. And same thing with Tricia and copy editing too, where I bring the idea and then I'm like, oh man, right. And Tricia doesn't have to say, you know, when you do this, you should do this. She just makes a note like, hey, maybe this, like what Kevin was saying, maybe this part doesn't need to be here or whatever. And you start to see that for yourself, like, oh, I understand why that doesn't need to be there. Or in copy editing, you see the word echo and you're like, then you're more aware of it the next time you sit down to write. So for me, it's a combination of this sort of instinctual, does this jive? Can I move to this? And just being really open-minded to the, you know, like to your editors.
Yeah, thanks for the kind words, Josh. It sounds like it's important to have like trusted people in your life that you can take advice from. Do any of you have those people in your life that you can rely on a regular basis for good advice about your writing? We'll start with Kevin.
I still have this friend, but he doesn't actually provide the alpha reading service that he did when I was first starting out. Because eventually I kind of got the hang of things. But when I first started up my first 4 books, every time I wrote a chapter, I would send it off to him because he thinks completely differently from me. He's a math professor. And he sees things that I would never see. And so he would point out logical inconsistencies and things like that. And when you're writing a fantasy, boy, sometimes you really need that. So he was just awesome when I was first starting out. And then once I started to get the hang of things, I didn't need to bother him after that. So now we just hang out on Zoom and we paint little models together and we don't even talk about writing at all. But it was awesome to have him help me out when I was first starting.
Kaya?
Yes, kind of along similar lines. I find that like some of the best people to read my work aren't necessarily writing the exact same thing I'm writing. Like, so I have a poet who reads my work and nobody will criticize your line integrity and your word choices like a poet. And then I have a friend who was a screenwriter that I met in undergrad. And if you ever want your dialogue checked, those are the people that you want because they will absolutely ding you on that. And so just that idea of these people who are, you know, in these fields in different ways, but their sophistications and their strengths are, you know, vastly different from yours. And so there are things that you may undervalue that they highly value. And you'll see like, oh yeah, like line integrity, word choice, these things that are, you know, either too small or too big for you to really like grasp, they kind of force you to like really actually see them. And then the last one is my sister, who is not at all a writer. She's a pure reader and she likes reading stuff that is interesting and she doesn't care about like high art. And she's perfect because she's always just like, why are you being boring here? Stop being boring. And I think it's really important to have that person who's like not, you know, really indoctrinated into the way, but just like literally like the person you're trying to reach out in the world.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies from project to project, but I am part of a couple of kind of sprawling, interconnected writing groups that have all different kinds of writers, which I think, yes, is very, very useful. So it's like screenwriters, comic book writers, novelists, journalists, like all kinds of things. And it's not that we necessarily critique each other's work all the time, but we can provide, you know, support for each other. If someone needs a beta read, they can usually find a volunteer amongst that group. I have a friend, Tom Wong, who I have been friends with for years. We have written some things together and he's part of that group. And he actually helped me break the last Heroine book, which is the 4th Heroine book. So I thought I knew what I was doing at this point, and I was really, really wrong about that. And he just, you know, he helped me break it. We got out the whiteboard and we kind of broke it the way that he's used to breaking an episode of television. And that was very, very helpful because it kind of helped me see the structure. It helped me see the characters again. It helped me to just see it written in different colors on the board. So that just like helps, I think, in breaking up your mindset. It helps you vary up the process a little bit. And then the other thing is sometimes when I've had a project that has a very specific audience, or maybe when I haven't written before, is that I'll try to kind of seek out who I know in that audience. So, you know, I also write YA sometimes. I wrote a YA rom-com called I Love You So Mochi that has no superpowers, no speculative elements. It's just like people being cute on vacation in Japan. And for that one, I talked to teenagers and I was like, oh, right. It's like teenagers who are not only reading this, but who are the characters in this book. And what I loved about that was they gave me advice I wouldn't have gotten from anyone else. You know, their experience of being Japanese American and going to Japan for the first time was very different than what maybe my experience would be as an adult. A lot of what they focused on, for example, were things that were potentially embarrassing, things that, you know, like would humiliate them in the center of a national monument, like just like cultural differences that they didn't know about. And so that was so interesting to me, because I think if I was writing from a perspective of like an adult like myself, that's not necessarily what would have been on my mind at first. But hearing them talk about it and hearing that come out, I was like, right, if I went to Japan for the first time as a teenager, here is kind of what my vision of that would be.
And finally, Alexis.
The person I kind of like work closely with my writing is actually my agent, Brooke Sherman. So I know not all agents are editorial, but mine very much is. And because this was my debut novel, I really didn't have like a lot of experience before my book deal. And Brooke's like, you know, gave me so much good advice and really taught me the process of like, here's how you edit, here's how you revise, here's how you make something better. And the thing about Brooks is that he's very much a straight shooter, and I think that's so important when it comes to like someone that you lean on for writing advice. You have to have someone who's kind and encouraging, but also someone who's not afraid to tell you the truth. And so Brooks always kind of like pushes me to make my work like the best that it can be. So working with him is really great. He has a great eye for stories, and I find that like that collaborative element, like knowing that there's someone here who like is, you know, equally invested in this story and his success is, you know, mine, and kind of working with him to create the best book that I can, it's like really fulfilling. So yeah.
So as I mentioned, we have some debut novelists on the panel. For the veterans, what advice would you give to our debut authors? And we'll start with Josh.
Oh man, I mean, I remember, I mean, it's not even that long ago. I remember when I got my first book deal, it was with Bird Box, and then I like, you know, I thought, okay, it's gonna come out next week, right? You know, like I thought it was like, because you've been like working so hard and impatient or whatever the phrase is, it's almost, it's not frustrated or impatient, but it's this like grueling, like I just want this to happen, right? My advice would be patience on the business side of things, on the release side of things, on the edit side of things, because there's a tendency to think like, you know, if we write a book right now, I mean, it might not come out for, you know, a year, 2 years, and that's kind of a heavy reality to swallow, because especially like in this era we're in right now, right? And there's so many moving exterior factors that you may be really passionate about writing, and then that opinion, that take, your voice isn't going to be heard for like a year or two, right? And that's a little bit like overwhelming in a novel form. Obviously, you could publish your thoughts in a million different ways. So, but I would say to just be patient in that way. Don't chew your fingernails off on waiting for it to come out. Write another one, work on something else. It's okay for your releases to be, I wouldn't say behind, but a little different than where you're at now. So, you know, you wrote a book 2 years ago and now you're in a different place. Okay, but that's still you too, that 2 years ago. And when it comes out, like be there for it and just be patient and just immediately swallow the reality that it takes a minute for stuff to come out.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah?
You know, I still feel very new in a lot of ways, but I think that the advice I would give, which is advice that I was given and which I was not always able to take, is to enjoy as much of it as you can. You know, we all write lots of books. You are not defined by one book, but your debut year is special. And I know that this year is like extra weird to debut. But I have been very like encouraged by seeing the creative ways that people have come up with of getting books out there, the way that indie bookstores have stepped up, the way that publishers have stepped up, the way that, you know, the books are still getting out there. There are still events happening, even if they are recorded like this. And I think when I was, you know, it goes by so fast. It's so chaotic. There's so much happening. And I think when I was in it, I always really appreciated the moments when I was able to kind of stop and tell myself, you know, remember you did that. Like you did that. You did a thing that you wanted to do and that you didn't know if you could do, and that probably, you know, other people thought you couldn't do. So just like to remember that, like, you went from that to being able to hold this in your hands, I think is so special and is so deserving of just that moment for yourself where you remember that this is something that you achieved.
Kevin?
Sarah basically said what I was going to say.
Oh.
But that you
does
want,
that.
Yeah, she's awesome.
Yeah.
But in terms of not this year, but every year going forward, every single high that you get to experience in publishing, savor the heck out of it, because of course they arrive sporadically. And whenever you have an achievement to celebrate, I urge you to celebrate the heck out of it and record it for yourself, or have someone record it for you or whatever, so that you can remember those, because of course not every day is a super high. So there are a lot of times when you are, you know, writing in complete anonymity and under your blanket, you know, that kind of a thing. And, you know, so yeah, just definitely savor all of the good times that you have right now, and then, you know, going forward through your career, because you'll have new things to celebrate as you go.
I actually just remembered something that a friend of mine who had debuted a couple years before me, like at her first book event, she was telling this story about champagne corks. And she basically said, every time something happened, like even if it wasn't something good, I popped a bottle of champagne and I kept the cork and I put it in this bag. And that was for every step. She's like, when I got an agent, when we went on submission, when it was rejected everywhere, when we revised and resubmitted, when it went on submission again, you know. And so by the end of it, she had this giant bag of champagne corks. And that was kind of like this milestone of like, here is the life of this book. And I thought that was really lovely. And, you know, I don't always do something like that, but every time something even a little bit good or a little bit momentous happens, I try to mark the occasion in some way, so that, you know, I like to think of all of us having our own like metaphorical bag of champagne corks, whatever that may be for you.
Totally awesome. I want to take that idea for my own life, because yeah, to look back at a giant bag, it's like you went through all that. Yeah. All those little corks are an experience, a moment, a feeling. That's an awesome idea.
Yeah.
And so for our debuts, what advice would you give to authors who are seeking to publish their debuts, or who are just getting started with writing? Oh, Kaya.
Oh, yeah. I would just say, like, the most, like, absolutely nobody else's vision for success has to be yours. You know, there are people whose only vision for success is like an extremely literary book that's going to be taken to certain markets, and people whose only vision for success is something different. But your vision for success can be completely different than what you've seen modeled for you or what other people are telling you to prioritize. And once you let go of that, which, you know, is important to other people, but not necessarily yours, like, you can actually achieve, like, be happy and like enter this realm in which it's about like what you value. And that's so much more important than some sort of like universal metric of quality.
Alexis?
Create a space in your life for the writing. When everything changed for me and I really started to connect with my work and I think get better as a writer, it was when I pulled this old desk. I was homeschooled for my entire like elementary school, middle school, and high school. And in college, I pulled out the desk that I was homeschooled at, or I did all of my schoolwork growing up, and I repainted it and I made it my writing desk. And I would just sit there and write like for 30 minutes, hour, whatever I had to spare. And when I created that space, it could be a physical space or a mental space, whatever, everything changed for me. And that's actually where I wrote this book. And so it was really interesting to see, like, when I was territorial about the space that I created in my life for writing, how everything sort of unfolded after that. So, yeah.
So in addition to advice, there's also a lot of rules out there. Like never use adverbs, never use the same dialogue tag twice. Are there any rules you especially love to break? We'll start with Kevin.
That never use adverbs thing, that was on that L. Warren Leonard list that I was talking about earlier. So he has things on there that, never use anything other than said, as a dialogue tag or stuff like that. And those are things where I'm like, well, I'm not going to do that, and then, so some of the things that, as our other panelists were saying, take what you need and will work for you and leave the rest. So I'm not sure that I take delight in certain things, except I do notice when somebody says never do something and then I will do it, oh, that worked, didn't it? So yeah, those kinds of blanket generalizations are never really effective, and you will always find exceptions to the rules and other people's writing, as well as you have the ability to do it yourself. So,
Josh?
Well, one that I try to break as often as possible, but it's not easy, is a lot of people's advice is like, that each chapter should ramp it up, that this should be more powerful than the last chapter, and this and this and this, but I agree that we should be going somewhere, but I also feel like sometimes, and I write horror, sometimes a quiet beat can be the scariest moment in the entire novel, and doesn't have to be some action explosion, right? So I find myself looking for those moments, or to break that rule, whatever, in terms of like the escalation. That escalation doesn't have to just mean action, madness, franticism, violence, any of those things. It could also just be like suddenly the character's alone, and that quiet is more powerful, or its own variety of things being ramped up.
Alexis?
Mine is really similar to Josh's, which is that I like a slow beginning sometimes as a reader and a writer. Sometimes I like to be eased into a story, and everyone always says like to start with a bang. And sometimes, that means just start with something that's interesting. It doesn't have to be like a big explosion or a murder. And sometimes that means like literally start with something super explosive and eye-catching on the first page. And sometimes I love that. And other times I kind of like being eased into a story slowly. So, yeah.
Can I add on to what you're saying? Because
yes,
we both write horror. I wonder if it, with what we both came to that, because if you think about it in this day and age, right? Anytime you read a horror novel or see a scary movie, you know that you're experiencing a horror story. Like if you go on Netflix, it's in horror or whatever. So you and I have like the horror itself as a character, meaning someone's watching this movie or reading this book, they know it's going to be scary. That means we don't have to bring in the horror right away, because because like we just got like, let's say a Placid Drive, and now the longer the horror's off camera, off page, the scary is starting to get like, oh, what's going to happen here? Because something's got to happen here that says this is a scary movie. Is this the moment? Is this the moment? Is this the moment? So you and I get to like play with that, and I think that enables us to break some rules, like you're saying, like a slower beginning, because the reader knows something's on its way.
Exactly. It creates the dread that I think is scarier than almost anything else, is this like anticipation. Yes.
Right. Exactly. And then we can never bring it in, never show it at all, like Bird Box.
Yes.
And then you realize, oh shit, I never brought it in. Oh.
So good. Yeah.
Okay,
sorry.
Go for it.
I was laughing at the Bird Box thing.
Yes.
Yeah, so I have a very simple one, and a less simple one, which is like never start a sentence with a conjunction. And I have never met a sentence I didn't want to start with and, or like, but I like violating that space where it's like, oh, you thought you were done. And I'm also one who, I don't know, I was raised wrong and I like to fight. So as soon as I'm told like, this is an absolute don't do that, even if I've never done it before, I'm like, well, let's see. So I think one of the last ones was someone said, you never need like a prologue, like, or an epilogue rather. You never need an epilogue. You should never do that. Just get right into it. And I was like, okay, bet. And then it's like the next project I was working on, I was like, let's see what we can do with this. Let's deliberately do this thing that I've never done before. Because again, like I'm very stubborn and you can't tell me anything. So it's that same thing where it's like, there could be these incredibly fun, like fruitful exercises that come in rule breaking and these like transgressions of the literary.
And finally, Sarah.
I love all these broken rules mentioned. I just they like give me strength. No, I love adverbs. I love a slow horror beginning. I love all of that. I love a good prologue. I think that like the prologue thing comes from like, if you read like a lot of discarded prologues, probably they weren't necessary to the story. Maybe that was just someone getting something out, or they thought they were trying to start with a bang, like, so they started later and then kind of turned the clock back. I have a prologue in a book that I'm very protective of because I think it's amazing, and I will fight you over that prologue.
Yes.
One that I'll bring up that I haven't heard yet is Show Don't Tell. Which I think is something that actually messed me up a little bit when I was trying to write the first chapter of my debut, which is, a fantasy world. It's kind of like our world, but obviously there are some differences that need to be explained. There are people with superpowers. There are cupcakes who have fangs and demonic abilities. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on that's obviously not our world. And I got so stuck in that first chapter because I was really trying to show, don't tell. And I think what kind of finally broke me out of it was, I was reading like a lot of, especially like urban fantasy and paranormal romance and things that this book were kind of in line with. And a lot of books in those subgenres, I think, do a wonderful job of telling things creatively, of sort of giving you like this kind of world building exposition in a very creative way. A lot of times it's in the character's voice, and the character's a lot of fun. So we want to hear them tell us a story, even if they're not showing us anything. And so one thing I've really come to appreciate in books, especially in sci-fi and fantasy, is like the creative telling. Like, I feel like that's always something I notice when someone is like telling me something and maybe not showing me anything, but it's so entertaining that I am swept along with the voice and the story, and I would rather have them tell me that information than be confused later.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you said all that. First of all, you're very good at this.
Oh, thank you.
I'm really glad you said all that, because some of my favorite stuff in old school horror would be like two people at a table. One's like, the worst thing happened. The other's like, what? And the other guy's, well, let me tell you. And then it's like a story, and everything's so like, and Joseph Conrad made like an entire career out of novels that way. But yeah, that's cool to hear you say that. All your guys' advice on that one was awesome.
So a lot of writers learn by reading the work of other authors. Who is an author you have learned a lot from, and what have you learned from their work? We'll start with Alexis.
N.K. Jemisin, I am obsessed with her. I think that she is just ridiculously talented, the way that she plays with language and story. I've just never seen someone do what she does with words. And so I think what I learned from her is to break a lot of rules and be brave and experiment with the way that you tell stories and experiment with like the conventions of genre. She really does inspire me to kind of challenge myself with my work and approach the things that I write in a new, different, maybe more complicated way. Can't recommend her work enough.
Sarah.
I will say a writer who I feel like I've learned a lot from, especially recently, is Helen Huang, who writes contemporary romance. She wrote The Kiss Quotient and The Bride Test, and she writes just so beautifully. And I think something that I have really tried to take in from the way that she writes the swoon and kind of the way that characters interact is I can feel on the page how much empathy she has for her characters. Like, there is something about it that is just tangible. You can tell reading her books how much she loves her characters, how much she's invested in them, how much even when they're maybe not making the best choice or not like doing the right thing, she still kind of gets you to a place of understanding why. And I think it's because, she really has that empathy for them. And that's something that, I think it is so beautiful and makes the characters better and makes their relationships better, and obviously makes me swoon even more. So that is something that I've really tried to think about and incorporate, especially when I have maybe a character I don't totally understand yet.
Kevin?
Victoria Dahl. Her last name is spelled D-A-H-L. She's a romance writer who I greatly admire, and I have learned so much from her about the building of inner conflict, and there's so much drama that just goes on inside of people's heads, but how to illustrate that, and keep that really interesting and so on. That's a skill. That is not a natural thing. You really got to work at that, and that's I learned a lot from her, by reading her books about showing that kind of stuff. And I don't think I do nearly as good a job as she does at that kind of thing, but she's fantastic to read. And romance in general is very different, of course, from what I usually write, which involves pow, kerbiff, right? And there's a lot of action, which I already know how to do, but some of the inner stuff is things that I need to work on. So Victoria is fantastic, and I love her work, and I can recommend anything she's written as a great start. Of course, there are a ton of awesome romance writers out there besides her who will also teach you the same kinds of things.
Kaya?
Yeah, anybody who knows me for more than 5 minutes knows I'm obsessed with Toni Morrison. Most of my undergraduate work was on her, but kind of Toni Morrison and like Helen Oyeyemi in the same way, where they force the reader to trust them because they're comfortable with their reader's discomfort. It's like, I'm not going to explain this. You're just going to have to go with it. Maybe it's a baby ghost. We don't know. You're just going to have to go. And I'm going to write beautifully enough that you're going to want to go not knowing. And that kind of, that allowing the reader to flounder a little bit but having such a beautiful journey that they don't care that they're floundering is something that I'm like very insecure about, having an academic background. I'm like, let's explain things. Let's make things clear. Where's your thesis statement? Whereas like reading their work kind of frees you up, where it's just like, Sula comes to town, there's a flock of birds. Will it matter? We don't know, just roll with it. You just have to you trust them so utterly, and they force you to trust them, but they also make it so beautiful that you cannot help but trust them and you want to. And that's something that really has benefited me in my writing. And obviously like their work has meant a lot to me just as a person and as a human being, but those are definitely my two.
Kaya, thank you for saying, where's your thesis statement? That gave me a flashback. I was an English teacher for 17 years, so that took me back there. Yeah. I've said that very thing, quite a few times.
Topic sentences, Kevin.
Wow, that's cool, Kevin. What age? What college, high school? What was it?
Yeah, I was teaching freshmen through seniors in high school. Yeah.
Wow, cool. That's amazing. You must have been amazing as a teacher, man.
It depends on who you ask.
And Josh, finally you.
I've never read Toni Morrison, by the way, and I'm looking. I have Beloved right here, and a lot of people, I'm not on such a strict horror diet. It's terrible for your skin, but I have. I've been reading mostly only horror and scary stuff, and people tell me that Beloved is like borderline horror novel. I know it's much more than that, but I think because of what you just said, I'm going to read that book next, and it's literally right here. For me, Virginia Woolf is a huge one because I was able to see this sort of like gloom that I don't know why I'm attracted to in literature, but still had an engine behind it. Still had, like, it was almost like a friend once told me that in a way all writing is optimistic, and I think what he meant was like as if there's a purpose to it, or that someone might read it. Like the act of writing is in and of itself optimistic. And I think that Virginia Woolf kind of showed me in practice what he meant, that even though there's some dark, bleak themes and things can be very gloomy, there's still like an engine that propelled it the whole time. And that was a real learning lesson for me. And then Melville, Poe, those two dudes really have taught me, like, don't be afraid to be enthusiastic, like don't try to be cool in your writing. Go for it, be frantic, be crazy, go, like, feel it, go, go, go. Those two guys are, if you guys, even later on, can think of other writers that have that similar lust for life, versus telling a story, I'm really attracted to that kind of thing. And those two dudes really, really taught me something about that.
So sadly, we are just about out of time, but I know our audience will want to hear much more from all of you if they want to find you online. Let's let them know where they can find you, starting with Kevin.
You can find me at Kevin Hearne on Twitter and Instagram. And of course, I've got a website, kevinhearne.com, with all my books on there. And please feel free to swing by and say howdy. I'm always happy to hear from folks.
Also, Kevin, if people want writing advice, I think you might know a bard that they can ask.
Well, yeah, you know what? Delilah and I have a podcast called Ask the Bards, and you can go to askthebards.com, and there's 14 episodes on there right now where we kind of do deep dives on all kinds of writing questions. We've basically stopped that now because we didn't really feel that now is the time to keep on going with that. So, but the 14 episodes remain up, and you can go back and see them at any time. So please do. We basically did it to help people out. So we hope you find something helpful there.
Cool. Kaya?
Yes, you can find me arguing with strangers on Twitter. No, I'm kidding. We don't do that anymore. It's just at Micaiah_Johnson. And that's where I spend too much of my time. I will soon have a website. I've been getting yelled at about it. I'm going to do the thing, I promise.
Sarah?
Yes, similarly, you can also find me on Twitter most of the time. It's just my name, at Sarah Kuhn. If I'm on there a lot, I'm probably on deadline, probably supposed to be doing something else. I'm also on Instagram as Sarah Kuhn Books because someone took Sarah Kuhn. I don't know why, they're not using it, but that's where you can find me on Instagram. And I do have a website that I desperately need to update, but it's heroinecomplex.com. That's heroin, like super heroin, not like the drug.
Alexis?
You can find me on Twitter at Alex H. Writes, or on Instagram as Lexis, Lexis H. So, yeah.
And Josh?
Where to find me? Well, I live at 44. No. What if I don't want them to find me? It's just my last name, or Josh Malerman, everywhere on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Because I guess my last name's a little more rare than I realized, or I got there before my brothers. But Josh Malerman, all those places.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us for the panel today, and enjoy the rest of Comic-Con at home.
And thank you, Tricia.